Hi, folks. Are we started?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, folks. My name's Herb Connor, and I welcome you viewers to Fort Christina National Historical Site. This is historical for several reasons. One of them is that it's the foundation point of the New Sweden colony in 1638. Now, a lot of Americans don't even know there was a New Sweden colony, but there was, and it started right here. And eventually it included both sides of the Delaware River, all the way up to what is now Philadelphia. The Swedes called it Nya Korsholm, but you're probably more familiar with it as Philadelphia. So we have here a small park, and while it does not contain a Fort Sumter, for example, it does contain a lot of the historical elements that have made this significant through the years. Now, if I'm going to tell a story, which is what I'm going to do, well, I'd like to start once upon a time. Chris Columbus tried to find India, and instead he found the Bahamas. I really like the Bahamas, and that's all I'm going to say about Chris Columbus. So then, um, Columbus aside, over the next 100 years, first Spain and Portugal, and then most of the Western European countries became involved with either trying to conquer or set up trading posts, set up colonies in different parts of North and South America and the Caribbean islands. So when that was going on, Sweden was coming into its own as a nation, and it conquered what is now Finland. And then in the 30 Years' War, that started in 1618, it conquered a good bit of the northern Baltic coast. They were a significant military factor in that awful war. You could think World War I or World War II as a comparison, but the Swedes had arguably the best land army in the battles. So they other colonies, some of them were doing fairly well. All of them were struggling. It was hard for the Europeans to survive here. One of the things most people don't know about is that the period is now called by climatologists the Little Ice Age. It was about 7 degrees Fahrenheit cooler then than it is now. So, for example, every winter, the Hudson River at Manhattan and the Delaware River at Philadelphia would freeze the whole way across. So this was not a climate that was friendly to people from Spain or Portugal. Further down toward the Caribbean, they were doing better there. But up here, it was more Northern Europeans who were interested. In 1609, Heinrich Hudson, working under the English version of his name, Henry Hudson, was a sea captain who explored these coastal waters for the Dutch. And he turned over a nice set of maps, and I suspect he kept himself a copy, which he would have given to the Netherlands. And so he explored up what is now the Hudson River, and he explored up the Delaware River, and he discovered Hudson's Bay, which didn't end well for him. But in any case, he set the Dutch interest growing. Now, the Dutch at this time were some of the greatest sailors in the world, traders for goods, and they had invented the modern corporation with shareholders and corporate boards as we now know it. So people who had invested, taken a little risk, and put a few guilders into a share of the Dutch East India Company were suddenly fabulously wealthy because the company was trading for spices in what is now Indonesia and making a fortune. Nutmeg in that period was literally worth, an individual nutmeg, more than its weight in gold in Europe. There was a lot of money to be made. So the Dutch were interested in expanding that into North America. And they decided to set up a colony. They created a corporation, the Dutch West India Company, and they came together and decided that the place to put it would be near what is now Albany, New York, where three rivers converge. They said that'll be good for easy trade, and it's well back, so, hopefully we won't get bothered too much. And so for a few years that lasted, but it was not going well. They were not getting as much trade as they hoped. They fired the first two director generals, and then they hired a man named Pierre Minuit. Now, when I was in school, we called him Peter Minuet. He was, though, in fact, from a French-speaking district, and he signed his name, Pierre Minuit. So out of respect, I'm going to call him by his name the way he signed it. Well, Pierre Minuit came over and sailed up the Hudson to where the trading post was and looked around and said, why in the world did you put the trading post here? Yeah. We need to be down at that beautiful harbor down there that I sailed through 3 or 4 days ago. And so he moved the colony to the southern tip of Manhattan. In order to have the colony be safe, he built a wall east-west across that lower tip of Manhattan. That wall is now what we call Wall Street. The wall is no longer there, but the street still is. Likewise, they dug a canal that looked right out into the ocean. There are very good maps of this. We know what we're talking about here. Well, the thing about a canal that faces into the ocean is that the tide flushes it twice a day. And let's say if you have anything that needs to be flushed, you can just dump it in the canal. Early sanitation. Anyway, there was a broad path that went up the western side of Manhattan that was used by the native people as a trade route. So he built a big double gate where that path came to the wall. And that path up the side is now known as Broadway, which the Dutch had left deliberately wide so they could move big things as part of the trading. And he built a fort. Now, the fort that he built filled what is now a city block in Manhattan, the block that is now the Native American Museum. And the size of that block gives us a good indication of roughly how big that fort was. I'll come back to that point. So you want to walk with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we have the setting that Pierre Minuit is building up what will become a very successful colony at Manhattan. And then the stockholders back in Amsterdam, who've never been to the New World, get a not so bright idea. And they decide that they will make a lot of money by having tobacco plantations on the Hudson River and using the native people as slaves. So he writes back that this is a terrible idea. Instead of simply following orders, he writes back and says, this is a terrible idea. First of all, we get half our food trading with them. And second, I've seen them fighting with one another. They are tough fighters. Yes, we have guns called matchlocks that have to stand on a post, and you can fire it and then spend 90 seconds to 2 minutes reloading it, one shot. And in the meantime, a couple guys are coming at you with a tomahawk. No, you don't want to do this. Well, they took his advice for the time being, but they didn't like his attitude. So they fired him. Historical note, 2 governor generals later, the governor general did try it, Governor Kieft, and he almost got the colony wiped out in the Peachtree War by the native people. Eventually they settled it, but it did not go well for that period for the Dutch. In the meantime, though, Minuit needs a job. He knew some people from Sweden, and he went to them and said, listen, I know you guys are interested in having a trading post, a colony. I know just the place. I surveyed it for the Dutch, but the Dutch have no claim to it. They've never done anything to in any way claim the land. So if you give me an expedition, I can take it there and set it up like I did the one at Manhattan. And so he pardon me for a moment, catching my breath and catching my point in the discourse. He came to Stockholm, and he worked with the Swedes to set up an expedition. They decided to use two ships, a large one, the original Kalmar Nyckel. Kalmar Nyckel means the key to the city of Kalmar. And it was bought as a coastal defense ship. It was Dutch built, of all things. So, but the Dutch were the best shipbuilders in the world. It was, Mercedes-Benz or whatever you want to compare it to. They were good at it. So they set up the expedition, a smaller ship that could go ahead of the big ship and look out for shallow water so the big ship didn't run aground. That was called the Flying Griffin, or if your Swedish is better than mine, the Fågelgrip. So they continued coming down toward, they planned to leave a little earlier, but as it turned out for various reasons, they left the coast of Sweden on December 1st. And they sailed across the Baltic, which is cold water, and around Denmark and out into the North Sea, which is cold water. And while they were in the North Sea, they were going to go north of Scotland to not have the Dutch know anything about what they were doing, but they hit a storm and they lost their bowsprit. So they had to pull into the Dutch port of Texel to refit, which they did, and they ended up then leaving on New Year's Eve and heading out into the North Atlantic. Now, this is not my idea of a pleasure cruise. This would have been cold the whole way. The only fire aboard would be the cook's stove. Why would they time it like that? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple. They arrived here at the end of March. And when they got here, some of the people that they had brought were building the fort, some of the people were setting up the trade post, and some of the people were farmers, because Minuit understood that they were going to have to grow a lot of their own food, or this whole thing wasn't going to work out. And he certainly didn't want his colony to fail for a reason like that. So they came here. They started building a fort, and we're near where the fort was now behind me. If you look at the monument in the paved area, that's part of where the fort once stood. We know the fairly exact dimensions of the fort because a Swedish military engineer surveyed it in 1654 and was kind enough to include a size scale on the side of the survey map. So we know that 4 points, point to point, it was about 290 feet, the length of a football field. And so from that information, we are able to gather that the fort that he built here was essentially a duplicate of the one that he had built at Manhattan. And we have been able to show that the size of the two was very similar. Now, these were what's called a palisade fort, upright logs. And shall we keep going?
Yeah, no, keep going.
All right. So upright logs and all forming a wall of logs. And they set up a trading post inside the fort. They put a big building inside the fort that was about 130 by 30 feet, which was going to be the trading post, the warehouse, the church, the school, the jail, and where everybody would go if they were attacked. So it needed to be a big building. That's the typical size of a Viking longhouse, by the way. And as Swedish, formerly Vikings,